Something is breaking in the global system, and most people have not fully understood it yet. It does not begin with a currency collapse or a financial crisis. It begins with something much simpler. Ships stop moving the way they used to. Insurance companies hesitate. Energy flows become uncertain. And then, quietly, the structure that has supported global trade for decades starts to weaken. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is no longer behaving like a reliable corridor of energy. It is behaving like a contested space. That change may look tactical, even temporary, but its consequences are structural. Because the modern global economy is not built only on production or consumption, it is built on predictability. And when predictability disappears, systems begin to reorganize. For decades, the United States did not just dominate through military power or economic size, it anchored the global system through the dollar. Oil was priced in dollars. Energy trade reinforced dollar demand. Countries accumulated dollar reserves because they needed them to buy energy. This created a loop. Energy demand supported the dollar supported global trade, and global trade reinforced American influence. That system did not emerge overnight. It was built slowly through agreements, security guarantees, and trust. Gulf producers sold oil in dollars. The United States provided security in return. Shipping lanes were protected. The flow of energy remained stable. And because it remained stable, the financial system built on top of it became deeply entrenched. But this system depends on something very basic. It depends on the uninterrupted flow of energy through critical routes. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those routes. When it functions normally, the system appears stable. When it becomes uncertain, the system begins to strain. The current disruption is not just about restricting movement. It is about introducing doubt into the foundation of global energy trade. When tankers hesitate to pass through a choke point, the cost of energy rises. When the cost rises, contracts are renegotiated. When contracts are renegotiated, new terms begin to appear. And in those new terms, alternatives start to take shape. This is where the connection to the petrodollar becomes clear. The petrodollar system relies on consistent, large-scale energy transactions conducted in dollars. If those transactions become unstable, or if participants begin to explore other currencies to manage risk, the system starts to loosen. It does not collapse immediately. It erodes. And erosion is often more dangerous than sudden collapse, because it is harder to detect and harder to respond to. Now consider how other major powers view this situation. For countries that have long operated within a dollar-dominated system, disruption creates risk. But for countries that have been seeking alternatives, disruption creates opportunity. China has spent years preparing for a world where energy trade might not be entirely dependent on the dollar. It has built financial infrastructure, developed payment systems, and expanded its economic relationships with energy-producing countries. These efforts were not urgent when the system was stable. They become highly relevant when the system is under stress. When energy flows through the strait become uncertain, China faces a direct challenge. It depends heavily on imported energy. Any disruption affects its economy. But at the same time, it also sees the vulnerability of relying on a system controlled by others. So it begins to adjust. It secures alternative supply routes. It increases strategic reserves. It deepens relationships with suppliers willing to transact outside traditional frameworks. And most importantly, it creates mechanisms that allow trade to continue even if the existing system becomes unreliable. This is not a sudden shift. It is a gradual buildup of parallel structures. And that is the key dynamic many people miss. Global systems rarely collapse outright. They are replaced piece by piece. A new system grows alongside the old one. At first, it looks small and insignificant, but under pressure, it expands quickly. The Hormuz disruption accelerates this process. It forces participants to consider options they might have ignored before. It makes alternative systems more attractive, not because they are perfect, but because the existing system is no longer certain. At the same time, the United States faces a different kind of challenge. It must maintain the stability of the global system while also responding to the immediate crisis. Military presence increases, diplomatic efforts intensify, but each action carries cost. Maintaining open sea lanes requires sustained commitment. It exposes forces to risk. It raises the possibility of escalation. And escalation introduces uncertainty at a much larger scale. This creates a complex situation. The United States must act to preserve the system, but in doing so, it also highlights how dependent the system is on continuous intervention. And dependence changes perception. If a system requires constant protection to function, it begins to look less like a natural order and more like a managed one. That perception matters. Because once participants begin to see the system as managed rather than inevitable, they become more willing to explore alternatives. This is where the strategic layer becomes visible. The disruption of Hormuz is not only about restricting energy flow, it is about testing the resilience of the global system. It is about observing how quickly and effectively major powers can respond, and it is about identifying weaknesses that can be leveraged in the future. At the same time, other regional actors are calculating their positions. Energy producers consider whether to diversify their trade relationships. Importers evaluate how to secure supply under uncertainty. Financial institutions adjust risk models. Insurance companies redefine exposure. Each decision may seem isolated, but together they form a pattern. That pattern is adaptation, and adaptation, over time, leads to transformation. What most people focus on is the immediate impact. Rising prices, shipping delays, political tension. These are visible and important, but they are not the full story. The deeper story is about how repeated disruptions change behavior. If Hormuz becomes a recurring point of instability, even if it reopens periodically, the perception of risk remains, and that perception influences long-term decisions. Countries begin to invest in alternative routes, pipelines, overland corridors, diversified shipping paths. These investments reduce dependence on a single choke point. At the same time, financial systems evolve. If energy transactions become less predictable, participants seek more flexible arrangements. This can include currency diversification, bilateral agreements, and new payment mechanisms. Over time, these changes accumulate. The result is a gradual shift away from a single dominant system toward a more fragmented one. This does not mean the dollar disappears. It remains a major force, but its role changes. Instead of being the unquestioned default, it becomes one option among several. And that shift has significant implications. Because the power of a global currency comes not just from its usage, but from its necessity. When usage becomes optional, influence declines. This is why the current situation matters far beyond the region. It is not just a geopolitical conflict, it is a stress test of the global economic order. And stress tests reveal hidden dynamics. They show which systems are resilient and which are fragile. They expose dependencies that were previously ignored, and they accelerate decisions that might have taken years under normal conditions. At the same time, the risk of escalation remains present. Military forces operating in close proximity increase the chance of miscalculation. Economic pressure raises political stakes, and political stakes influence decision-making. This creates a feedback loop. Tension leads to action. Action leads to reaction. Reaction increases tension. Managing this loop requires careful balance. Too little response and the system weakens. Too much response and the situation escalates. This balance is difficult to maintain, especially under time pressure, and time is a critical factor here. The longer the disruption persists, the more adaptation occurs. The more adaptation occurs, the harder it becomes to return to the previous state. This is how temporary events create permanent change. At a certain point, the system does not revert, it evolves. That evolution is already underway. Energy routes are being reconsidered. Financial structures are being tested, strategic alliances are being adjusted. Each of these shifts may appear incremental, but together they represent a broader transformation. A move from a centralized system toward a more distributed one, a system where no single actor has complete control, a system that is more complex, more fragmented, and potentially more unstable. The question is not whether this transformation will happen, it is how quickly it will accelerate. If the disruption of Hormuz remains limited and temporary, the existing system stabilizes. Adjustments are made, but the core structure remains intact. If the disruption becomes prolonged or recurring, the pace of change increases significantly. Participants lose confidence in stability, alternatives gain traction, and the balance of power begins to shift. In that scenario, China's preparations become more influential, not because they replace the existing system entirely, but because they provide a viable alternative when the existing system falters. This is how new systems emerge, not by overtaking the old in a single moment, but by becoming more useful under pressure. And usefulness drives adoption. Adoption drives scale. Scale drives influence. This process is already visible in subtle ways. Energy deals negotiated in different currencies, payment systems operating outside traditional channels, strategic partnerships that bypass established frameworks. Each example may seem small, but collectively they indicate direction. And direction matters more than individual events, because it tells you where the system is heading. The current situation is not just a crisis, it is a signal that the assumptions underlying the global order are being tested, a signal that dependence on a single framework carries risk, and a signal that alternatives, once considered secondary, are becoming increasingly relevant. The final outcome is not predetermined. It depends on how actors respond. If stability is restored quickly and confidence returns, the existing system adapts and continues. If disruption persists and confidence erodes, the system evolves into something new. But one thing is becoming clear. The era of unquestioned dominance by a single economic structure is weakening. What replaces it may not be a single system, but a network of systems. More flexible, but also more complex. More distributed, but also more difficult to manage. And in that environment, power is no longer defined solely by size or strength. It is defined by adaptability, the ability to operate across multiple systems, the ability to manage uncertainty, the ability to influence outcomes without relying on a single point of control. That is where the world is moving, and the disruption of Hormuz is not the end of that process. It is the acceleration point. What happens next will depend on how quickly the global system adjusts, but the direction of change is already visible. The structure that once seemed permanent is becoming conditional, and once a system becomes conditional, it is no longer the foundation. It is just one layer in a much larger and more dynamic order.